What if an entire city was built on certainty, and that certainty was wrong from the very beginning? In the heart of one of the harshest deserts in North America, a place emerged almost overnight, driven by greed, hope, and blind belief in endless riches. Its name was Rhyolite, and for a brief moment it was supposed to become the richest mining town on earth. Rhyolite was born in 1904, deep in the Nevada desert, a landscape defined by extreme heat, brutal winds, and vast emptiness. There was no water source nearby, no fertile land, no natural reason for a city to exist there at all. And yet, men arrived by the thousands. They came with shovels, picks, and absolute conviction. Gold had been found in the surrounding hills, and that single discovery was enough to override every warning the environment was screaming. At the center of this frenzy was a belief shared by everyone who arrived. This was not just another mining camp. Rhyolite was different. Reports spread rapidly that the eye, or veins, were vast, rich, and practically limitless. Newspapers amplified the excitement, investors poured in money from across the United States, and prospectors spoke of fortunes waiting just beneath the ground. The desert, once ignored, suddenly became sacred ground. What followed was explosive growth that defied logic. In less than 2 years, Rhyolite transformed from a cluster of tents into a fully formed city. Streets were laid out. Brick buildings replaced wooden shacks. There were banks, hotels, a stock exchange, schools, theaters, saloons, a hospital, and even a red light district. Electric lights illuminated the night. Water was hauled in at enormous cost. Nothing about Rhyolite was modest. Everything was built with the assumption that the boom would last forever. This confidence was not accidental. Mining companies deliberately fueled it. Prospectuses exaggerated yields. Assays were selectively published. Every announcement emphasized potential, not reality. Investors, far from Nevada, many of whom had never seen a mine in their lives, bought shares convinced they were securing a piece of history. The idea of Rhyolite became bigger than the town itself. It was marketed as destiny. But beneath this optimism, cracks already existed. The gold deposits, while real, were not as rich as advertised. Extraction was expensive. The ore required complex processing, and the desert made every operation harder and more costly. Water had to be transported. Equipment broke, down under extreme conditions. Profits were thinner than expected, but these facts were buried under louder voices promising tomorrow's breakthrough. What made Rhyolite especially dangerous was its speed. Cities that grow slowly adapt. Rhyolite exploded. Thousands of lives became dependent on a single assumption, that the mines would deliver endlessly. Families moved in. Children went to school. Entire livelihoods became tied to rumors coming out of the hills. And as long as money kept flowing, in from outside investors, the illusion held. There was also a psychological force at play. No one wanted to be the first to doubt. Questioning the future of Rhyolite meant admitting you might have made the wrong choice. So skepticism stayed quiet. Warnings were dismissed as jealousy or cowardice. The desert itself seemed irrelevant, as if human ambition had conquered nature through sheer belief. Yet, from the very beginning, Rhyolite was balanced on a knife's edge. Its existence depended on gold that was already becoming harder to extract and easier to exaggerate. The city was loud, confident, and ambitious, but beneath the noise was an uncomfortable truth that few wanted to face. The foundation was far weaker than it looked. And as the promises grew louder, the reality underground was moving in the opposite direction. The moment Rhyolite declared itself unstoppable was the same moment it began quietly drifting toward disaster. If this story already feels unsettling, that reaction matters. Cities like Rhyolite did not vanish by accident, and understanding how blind certainty can build an entire civilization on unstable ground is the key to understanding what comes next. Take a moment to reflect on what you have heard so far, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Rhyolite was doomed from the moment it was founded? Or do you think there was a point where its fate could still have been changed? If this kind of deep, investigative storytelling keeps you watching, make sure to leave a like so this story can reach more people who are fascinated by lost cities and forgotten disasters. And if you want to follow the rest of this investigation into Rhyolite and other places the world tried to forget, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows stories like this to be told in full depth. Rhyolite did not grow the way cities normally grow. It did not evolve over decades, learning how to survive its environment step by step. It detonated into existence. Almost as soon as word spread that gold had been found, people began arriving faster than the desert could ever support them. Within months, the empty landscape surrounding the mines turned into a moving mass of humanity driven by urgency, fear of missing out, and raw ambition. By 1905, Rhyolite's population had surged into the thousands. Some estimates claimed 10,000 residents at its peak, a staggering number considering the complete absence of natural infrastructure. There was no river, no nearby farms, no established supply routes. Everything the city needed had to be hauled across miles of desert: food, water, lumber, machinery, fuel. Nothing arrived easily, and nothing arrived cheaply. Yet the population kept growing as if those limitations did not exist. This explosive growth created an illusion of legitimacy. People assumed that a city this large, this active, this loud with construction and commerce, had to be stable. Brick buildings rose where tents had stood only months earlier. A grand bank was constructed. Hotels advertised luxury in the middle of the wasteland. A stock exchange operated daily, trading mining shares that promised enormous returns. The speed of development became proof of success, at least on the surface. But beneath the expansion was chaos. Housing could not keep up. Many residents lived in makeshift shelters, sleeping in extreme heat during the day and freezing cold at night. Water shortages were constant. Prices skyrocketed. A single gallon of water could cost more than a full meal in other towns. Disease spread easily in overcrowded conditions, and medical facilities struggled to cope with injuries from mining accidents and desert exposure. What made the situation more unstable was who the newcomers were. Rhyolite attracted speculators as much as miners. Bankers, promoters, gamblers, and opportunists flooded in, many with no intention of working underground. Their income depended entirely on the belief that Rhyolite would keep growing. They opened businesses that assumed permanent prosperity: theaters, fine restaurants, newspapers, and investment offices. Every new storefront raised the stakes, making collapse unthinkable in the minds of those who depended on the boom. The railroads amplified this frenzy. When a rail line finally reached Rhyolite, it was celebrated as confirmation that the town had arrived. Trains brought in supplies, investors, and even tourists, curious to see the desert city everyone was talking about. But rail access also accelerated speculation. It made it easier to move money in and out quickly, turning Rhyolite into a financial gamble rather than a sustainable settlement. The most dangerous element was how fast expectations outpaced reality. Mining operations take time to stabilize. Ore quality varies. Costs fluctuate. But Rhyolite's population boom demanded immediate success. Every day, more mouths needed feeding. Every week, wages had to be paid. Every month, investors expected positive news. The city was no longer waiting for gold. It was consuming the future in advance. Social tension began to rise. Workers complained about unsafe conditions and inconsistent pay. Business owners blamed miners for slowing production. Mining companies blamed the environment, the equipment, or each other. Meanwhile, promoters continued publishing optimistic headlines, masking the growing strain beneath the surface. The louder the praise became, the more it served as a shield against uncomfortable truths. There was also a psychological trap. Once people committed everything to Rhyolite, leaving meant admitting failure. Families had sold homes elsewhere. Investors had poured savings into mining shares. Entire identities became tied to the idea that Rhyolite would succeed. Walking away felt worse than staying, even as signs of instability multiplied. By the time doubts began to circulate quietly, the city was already too large, too dependent, and too fragile. Rhyolite had become a place that needed constant motion to survive. If growth slowed even briefly, the consequences would be immediate and severe. And while the streets were busy and the buildings impressive, something essential was missing: a margin for error. For a long time, Rhyolite survived on a single idea: that the gold beneath the desert was vast enough to justify everything built above it. As long as that belief held, the city could ignore its own fragility. But underground, reality was far less generous than the stories told in newspapers and investment offices. The deeper miners went, the clearer it became that Rhyolite's wealth had limits, and those limits were approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit. The gold deposits around Rhyolite were real, but they were never simple. Much of the ore was low-grade, meaning it contained only small amounts of gold mixed with large quantities of rock. Extracting value from it required expensive crushing and chemical processing. This was not the kind of gold that could be shoveled out and sold quickly. Every ton demanded time, labor, water, fuel, and specialized equipment. In the desert, each of those elements came at a premium. At first, mining companies masked these difficulties. Early reports focused on potential rather than output. Investors were shown optimistic projections instead of hard numbers. Small successes were magnified into headlines, while delays and losses were framed as temporary setbacks. As long as fresh money kept arriving, operations continued, even if profits remained thin or non-existent. But by 1906, warning signs became impossible to hide from those closest to the mines. Production targets were being missed. Operating costs were climbing faster than expected. Machinery broke down under constant strain from heat and dust. Water shortages disrupted processing schedules. Some mines quietly reduced shifts or delayed wage payments, creating unease among workers who depended on steady income. Engineers and geologists began raising concerns. They warned that the richest veins were already being exhausted and that deeper layers were less promising. Processing costs would only increase with depth. These reports circulated internally, but rarely reached the public. Admitting them openly would have triggered panic. And panic was something Rhyolite could not afford. What made the situation especially dangerous was how much depended on perception. Rhyolite was no longer just a mining town. It was a financial ecosystem built on confidence. Banks issued loans based on projected output. Businesses extended credit, assuming continued growth. Investors expected constant appreciation. Even a small loss of faith could cause a chain reaction. Inside the city, subtle changes were already visible. Some businesses closed quietly, often overnight. Workers noticed paychecks arriving late or not at all. New construction slowed. Buildings that were planned never materialized. The optimism that once filled the streets began to sound forced, rehearsed, almost desperate. The press played a critical role in maintaining the illusion. Local newspapers, many financially tied to mining interests, continued printing glowing stories. Headlines spoke of expansion, new discoveries, and future breakthroughs. Negative information was minimized or reframed as temporary obstacles. Readers were encouraged to hold on, invest more, and trust that prosperity was just around the corner. Meanwhile, outside, investors started asking harder questions. Dividends failed to appear. Stock prices fluctuated wildly. Some quietly sold their shares and withdrew capital, triggering subtle but dangerous shifts in the city's financial foundation. Rhyolite had been built on the assumption of infinite momentum. Once that momentum slowed, even slightly, the structure began to wobble. There was also a human cost that rarely made headlines. Miners faced increasingly dangerous conditions as companies pushed operations harder to maintain output. Accidents became more frequent. Safety measures were often ignored in the rush to keep production numbers respectable. Injuries, sometimes fatal, were treated as unfortunate but acceptable losses in a town that valued results above lives. The desert amplified every mistake. Heat exhausted workers. Dust damaged lungs and equipment. Isolation meant repairs took longer and medical care arrived late. Rhyolite was fighting nature, economics, and its own mythology all at once, and the fight was becoming uneven. By the time whispers of failure began spreading openly, the city was already deeply entangled in its own promises. Too many people depended on success for the truth to surface without consequences. So the collapse did not arrive with a single dramatic moment. It crept in quietly, disguised as temporary setbacks, delayed shipments, and optimistic reassurances. Rhyolite was still, standing. Trains still arrived. Lights still burned at night. But the gold that justified everything was slipping away, ounce by ounce, lie by lie. And as confidence began to erode beneath the surface, the city unknowingly stepped into the most dangerous phase of its existence. As Rhyolite's mining reality grew more uncertain, another force tightened its grip on the town: speculation. Long before the city physically began to die, its financial core was already rotting. Money was still moving, but increasingly, it was no longer connected to gold in the ground. It was circulating through promises, inflated valuations, and deals designed to extract value quickly rather than build anything lasting. Mining stocks became the lifeblood of Rhyolite, and also its poison. Companies issued shares aggressively, often far beyond what their actual production could justify. New mining firms appeared almost overnight, many with little more than a claim staked on paper and a promotional brochure, filled with bold language and selective numbers. These companies did not need to mine gold to survive. They only needed people to believe they would. Promoters played a central role. They traveled between Rhyolite, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago, selling stories instead of ore. Investors were shown optimistic assays, projected yields, and artists' renderings of future facilities that would never be built. Risks were minimized. Costs were ignored. The desert was portrayed as a temporary inconvenience, not a permanent obstacle. In many cases, the same individuals promoting the mines were quietly selling their own shares as prices rose. Inside the city, corruption blended seamlessly into daily business. Bank loans were extended based on expected success rather than verified output. Local officials had financial interests in mining companies they were supposed to regulate. Newspapers accepted advertising money in exchange for favorable coverage. Negative reports were delayed, softened, or buried entirely. Information became a commodity, and truth was bad for business. This speculative environment created a dangerous illusion of health. Even as mining output stalled, stock prices fluctuated wildly, sometimes rising on rumors alone. A single optimistic headline could spark buying frenzies. A whispered concern could trigger sell-offs. The city's economy became disconnected from physical reality. Wealth existed on paper, but cash flow became unpredictable and increasingly scarce. For ordinary residents, this shift was subtle but devastating. Businesses extended credit to customers who were technically wealthy on paper but cash poor in reality. When those customers defaulted, shop owners collapsed with them. Wages were paid late or in partial amounts. Some companies began compensating workers with scrip or stock instead of money, trapping them deeper inside a failing system. Behind closed doors, insiders began preparing for exit. Mining executives moved assets out of Rhyolite quietly. Promoters relocated to new boomtowns, chasing the next story. Bankers tightened lending while publicly expressing confidence. The city's leadership continued hosting events, announcing plans and projecting strength, but their actions betrayed growing fear. One of the most damaging aspects of this corruption was how it silenced honest warnings. Engineers and accountants who raised concerns found themselves ignored or pushed aside. Admitting the truth threatened too many interests at once. Acknowledging that Rhyolite might fail would have collapsed property values, destroyed reputations, and exposed fraudulent behavior. So denial became policy. The result was a city draining itself from the inside. Capital that could have been used to stabilize operations or slow the collapse was instead extracted and exported. Rhyolite was being stripped financially long before buildings were abandoned. The desert would eventually reclaim the structures, but human greed had already emptied them of purpose. As speculation replaced substance, trust eroded. People began questioning not just the mines, but each other. Accusations spread. Lawsuits followed. Some investors demanded audits. Others simply vanished, leaving unpaid debts behind. The sense of shared destiny that once bound the town together fractured into suspicion and blame. By the time the broader public realized how deep the deception ran, the money that built Rhyolite was already gone. Not spent, not lost to nature, but deliberately removed by those who understood the game early enough to escape it. What remained was a city still standing, still pretending, but financially hollow. As Rhyolite's financial foundations weakened, the human cost of the collapse began to surface in darker, more disturbing ways. What had once been framed as a town of opportunity slowly gained a different identity, one shaped by tragedy, fear, and stories that spread faster than facts. Long before Rhyolite became a ghost town, people began whispering that something was deeply wrong with the place itself. Mining was always dangerous, but in Rhyolite, the risks multiplied. Companies pushed workers harder as profits shrank. Safety protocols were ignored. Exhausted men descended into unstable shafts day after day, driven by the fear of losing their jobs in a town with nowhere else to go. Cave-ins became more frequent. Equipment failures were common. Explosions from mishandled blasting. Powder claimed lives with little warning. Some bodies were recovered. Others were never found, buried somewhere beneath the desert rock. Accidents were often reported as unfortunate inevitabilities, but those close to the mines knew the truth was more complicated. Corners were being cut, repairs delayed, warnings dismissed. Each death was treated as the price of progress, even as progress itself became harder to justify. For families who lost fathers, sons and brothers, Rhyolite stopped being a place of hope and became a trap. Beyond the mines, violence and despair followed. Saloons multiplied as stress rose. Alcohol became an escape for men watching their futures collapse in slow motion. Fights broke out regularly. Some turned deadly. Records from the period mentioned stabbings, shootings, and unexplained disappearances that were quietly accepted as part of frontier life. Not every body was investigated. Not every story was written down. Suicides began to haunt the town. Investors, who lost everything. Business owners crushed by debt, and miners injured beyond recovery, faced lives with no clear path forward. In a place where leaving meant admitting total failure, some chose not to leave at all. These deaths were often spoken about in hushed tones, reinforcing the sense that Rhyolite carried an invisible weight that pushed people toward the edge. Disease added another layer of fear. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and limited medical care created ideal conditions for outbreaks. Pneumonia, infections from untreated injuries, and heat-related illnesses claimed lives quietly. The desert did not forgive weakness, and Rhyolite had grown too fast to protect its people properly. As tragedies accumulated, stories began to change. What were once tales of bad luck slowly transformed into something more ominous. People spoke of the town as if it were cursed. Some claimed the land itself rejected those who tried to tame it. Others believed greed had poisoned the place, that the desert was reclaiming balance, by destroying everything built on false promises. Strange anecdotes circulated. Miners reported hearing sounds underground that did not match any known equipment. Night watchmen claimed to see lights moving where no one should have been working. Families spoke of an oppressive feeling, as if the town carried a constant sense of tension that never fully lifted. Whether these experiences were psychological responses to stress or something more, they shaped you. How Rhyolite was remembered even while it still lived. Importantly, fear accelerated decline. Once a place gains a reputation for death and misfortune, people hesitate to invest their lives there. Workers began leaving if they could. New arrivals slowed. Businesses found it harder to attract customers. The myth of the curse fed directly into economic collapse, creating a feedback loop of fear and abandonment. By this stage, Rhyolite was no longer just failing financially. It was unraveling, emotionally. Trust between neighbors weakened. Hope thinned. Every tragedy reinforced the sense that the town's fate was sealed, that staying was dangerous not just economically, but spiritually. Rhyolite did not empty itself in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled in waves. One departure triggered another, until leaving became not a decision, but a reflex. At first, people told themselves the exits were temporary. A family heading west was looking for work. A merchant closing shop was, waiting for better conditions. But behind these explanations was a growing awareness that the town was no longer viable. The first to leave were those who could move quickly. Investors with capital elsewhere quietly pulled out. Promoters vanished overnight, their offices locked, papers left behind. Skilled workers followed, sensing that wages would soon stop altogether. What remained was a population increasingly composed of those with the least options. The poor, the injured, the indebted. People whose entire lives were now trapped inside a collapsing place. Businesses began to close in clusters. A grocery shut its doors, making it harder for nearby residents to stay. A water supplier failed, raising prices beyond what many could pay. Each closure created pressure on the next, and soon entire streets went dark. The soundscape of the town changed. Fewer wagons, fewer voices. Nights stretched longer, heavier, quieter. Rail service, once celebrated as Rhyolite's lifeline, became unreliable. As freight volumes dropped, trains reduced their schedules. When deliveries slowed, shortages worsened. When shortages worsened, more people left. The town entered a spiral where every loss amplified the next. There was no central moment of decision. Collapse became automatic. Families packed what they could carry. Furniture was abandoned. Businesses left inventory behind. Some homes were simply locked and never opened again. Others were stripped for parts by those still clinging to survival. Windows shattered. Roofs sagged. The desert, patient and relentless, began reclaiming space almost immediately. What made this abandonment especially brutal was how fast it happened. In just a few years, a city that once boasted thousands of residents was reduced to a fraction of that number. Children stopped attending school. Churches held services for nearly empty rooms. Newspapers printed thinner editions until they stopped printing at all. Those who stayed the longest were often bound by hope or fear. Hope that something would reverse the collapse. Fear of what awaited them beyond the desert. Leaving meant uncertainty. Staying meant watching everything decay around you. Many chose to wait, convinced that one more discovery, one more investor, one more miracle could still arrive. But miracles did not come. What arrived instead was silence. By 1911, Rhyolite was effectively dead as a functioning town. Essential services had vanished. Law enforcement left. Mail service ended. The last residents lived among ruins, surrounded by reminders of what the place had promised and failed to deliver. Eventually, even the most determined holdouts accepted reality. One by one, they locked doors for the final time and walked away. Some left notes. Some did not. The desert erased their footprints within hours. Rhyolite was now something else. Not a city, not even a town. It became a shell, frozen in the moment. Ambition collapsed. Buildings stood empty, exposed to wind and sun. The echoes of human presence lingered, but life itself was gone. And as the final lights went out, a new phase began. Rhyolite was no longer just abandoned. It was becoming a monument to failure, a place where stories would outlive the people who created them. Once the last residents left, Rhyolite entered a phase few cities ever experienced so completely. It was no longer declining. It was suspended. Time did not stop, but it began to move differently. Without people to maintain, repair, or defend it, the town became exposed to the full authority of the desert. And the desert wastes nothing. The buildings that once symbolized confidence and permanence were the first to reveal how fragile that confidence had been. Brick walls cracked under extreme temperature swings. Roofs collapsed as timber dried and split. Windows shattered under relentless wind. What had been designed to impress investors now stood defenseless against sun, sand, and silence. Some structures deteriorated, slowly, almost gracefully. The bank, built to project strength and stability, remained standing longer than most. Its stone facade resisted the elements, giving the impression that Rhyolite might still endure. Other buildings were not so fortunate. Wooden homes collapsed within years. Hotels that once promised luxury became hollow frames, their interiors exposed like skeletons. Looting accelerated the decay. Travelers passing through the region stripped buildings of anything valuable. Doors, fixtures, pipes, even bricks were removed and reused elsewhere. In some cases, entire structures were dismantled, piece by piece. What nature could not claim quickly, people finished off. Rhyolite was being erased both by the environment and by human opportunism. Yet the emptiness itself began to attract attention. Explorers, photographers, and curious visitors arrived, drawn not by gold, but by absence. They walked through silent streets, reading faded signs, and imagining lives that once filled the space. The town became a physical memory, a place where ambition still lingered in the shape of walls and foundations. One building in particular captured the imagination of everyone who visited: the bottle house. Built from thousands of glass bottles due to a shortage of traditional materials, it somehow endured when sturdier structures failed. Its survival felt symbolic, almost mocking. A house made from refuse outlasting buildings financed by fortunes. For many, it reinforced the idea that Rhyolite followed rules no one fully understood. As years passed, the desert asserted dominance. Sand filled rooms. Animals nested in collapsed structures. The wind whistled through doorways that once echoed with voices. At night, the town felt unnaturally present, as if something was waiting just beyond sight. Even skeptics admitted there was an unsettling atmosphere, a sense that Rhyolite was not entirely empty. This atmosphere fed the legends. Visitors reported feeling watched. Some claimed to hear footsteps where no one walked. Others described sudden drops in temperature or an oppressive stillness that made them uneasy. Whether imagination or something more, the effect was consistent. Rhyolite did not feel like a dead place. It felt like a place that remembered. The absence of life became its identity. Rhyolite transformed into a ghost city, not just because it was abandoned, but because it refused to disappear completely. The ruins remained visible, stubborn, as if the desert itself wanted to preserve the lesson. And that lesson lingered in every cracked wall and empty doorway. This was what happened when belief outran reality, when ambition ignored limits, when an entire city trusted promises instead of facts. But even as Rhyolite settled into silence, its story was not finished. The emptiness created space for something else to grow: stories, legends, and the idea that this place was not merely abandoned, but marked. When Rhyolite became silent, stories began to speak in its place. With no daily life to drown them out, rumors, legends, and strange accounts took root and spread. What had once been explained as stress, exhaustion, or coincidence slowly transformed into something darker. Rhyolite was no longer just a failed mining town. It became a place people described with caution. Local travelers were among the first to report unsettling experiences. Those passing through the ruins claimed the town felt heavier than other abandoned places. The air seemed unnaturally still, even when the desert wind howled just beyond the streets. Some visitors described a persistent sense of unease, as if they were intruding somewhere they were not welcome. Stories emerged of sounds without sources. Footsteps on gravel where no one stood, metallic echoes that resembled mining activity long after the mines had collapsed. Night visitors spoke of distant voices carried on the wind, too faint to understand, but clear enough to feel deliberate. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as imagination, amplified by isolation and expectation. Yet the consistency of the stories kept them alive. The desert played its own role in shaping the myth. Temperature shifts caused buildings to expand and contract, producing sudden cracks and groans. Wind funneled through broken structures created low, unnatural tones. Shadows moved unpredictably as clouds crossed the sun. For those unfamiliar with the environment, these effects felt intentional, as if the town itself were responding to their presence. Over time, Rhyolite's history blended with superstition. The tragedies that occurred during its collapse were reinterpreted as signs of a curse rather than consequences of human decisions. Greed, exploitation, and deception were no longer just moral failures. They became triggers that awakened something hostile in the land. The desert was no longer neutral. It was portrayed as judgment. Some locals warned against staying after sunset. Others claimed equipment malfunctioned near the ruins, watches stopped working, or compasses behaved erratically. These stories varied in detail but shared a common theme. Rhyolite resisted attention. Those who lingered felt watched. Those who disrespected the site reported misfortune afterward. The idea of the curse gained strength through repetition. Guidebooks and early ghost town enthusiasts began referencing Rhyolite as a place of bad luck. Photographers spoke of cameras failing. Campers claimed restless nights filled with unexplained anxiety. None of these accounts could be verified conclusively, but none were easily dismissed either. Psychology played a powerful role. Visitors arrived already aware of Rhyolite's violent collapse and tragic reputation. Expectations shaped perception. A creaking wall became a warning. A shadow became a presence. Yet even acknowledging this does not fully explain why Rhyolite inspired stronger reactions than many other ghost towns built on similar failures. One theory suggested that the concentration of sudden deaths, financial ruin, and abandonment created a collective memory embedded in the place. Another argued that Rhyolite's isolation amplified human vulnerability, stripping away comfort and control. In that state, the mind searched for meaning in every sensation. Whether supernatural or psychological, the effect was undeniable. Rhyolite became a place people approached with curiosity and caution. It was not visited casually. It demanded attention, respect, and restraint. The ruins seemed to warn rather than invite. As these legends grew, Rhyolite's identity shifted once more. It was no longer just evidence of a failed boomtown. It became a symbol, a reminder that some places do not simply die. They linger, they watch, and they remember. Long after Rhyolite emptied, people continued to believe it could be brought back. The ruins looked solid enough. The mines, though weakened, still existed, and the desert, to outsiders, appeared unchanged. From a distance, it seemed logical to assume that the town had simply been abandoned too early, that timing, not reality, had caused its fall. That belief fueled a series of revival attempts that all ended the same way. In the years immediately following the collapse, small groups of investors returned to inspect the mines. They arrived with new equipment, revised projections, and the same optimism that had once built the city. Each group believed the previous failures were due to poor management, not poor geology. They reopened shafts, ran tests, and issued familiar promises of renewed productivity. For a short time, activity returned, and then it stopped. The problem never changed. The ore was still low grade. Extraction costs remained high. Water was still scarce. Transportation was still expensive. Technology improved, but not enough to reverse the fundamental imbalance between effort and reward. Each revival attempt ended quietly, with abandoned tools and unpaid bills left behind as evidence. In the 1920s, another idea surfaced. If mining could not save Rhyolite, perhaps tourism could. Ghost towns were becoming curiosities, symbols of the Old West that attracted travelers seeking nostalgia and mystery. Rhyolite's ruins were dramatic and accessible, making it a candidate for reinvention as a destination. Once again, expectations rose. Temporary structures were added, signs were installed, guides attempted to turn decay into attraction. For a brief moment, Rhyolite drew attention, but the desert proved unforgiving. Maintaining even minimal infrastructure required constant effort and money. Without a permanent population or reliable income, the project collapsed under its own weight. Later efforts were even smaller. Individual caretakers attempted to protect buildings. Artists used the ruins as canvases. Filmmakers passed through, using Rhyolite as a backdrop for stories of desolation and collapse. Each effort added to the town's visibility, but did nothing to restore life. Rhyolite could be visited, photographed, and interpreted, but not revived. What all these attempts shared was a misunderstanding of what Rhyolite represented. It was never just a town that failed. It was a system built on assumptions that no longer applied. Reviving it would require rewriting the environment, the economy, and the psychology that shaped it. No investor, no technology, and no creative vision could change those fundamentals. Over time, even optimism faded. Rhyolite stopped being seen as a sleeping city and started being accepted as a permanent ruin. Preservation replaced revival. The goal shifted from rebuilding to remembering. The town became a warning rather than a project. Yet the desire to resurrect it never fully disappeared. Even today, visitors stand among the ruins and imagine alternatives. What if the gold had been richer? What if the management had been honest? What if patience had replaced urgency? These questions linger because they feel close to answers. But Rhyolite offers none. It remains suspended between what was promised and what actually happened. A place where second chances were attempted again and again, only to prove that some collapses are final, not because no one tried, but because reality refused to cooperate. Rhyolite did not disappear quietly, and it did not disappear without leaving something behind. What remains today is more than crumbling walls and empty streets. It is a physical record of what happens when ambition outruns reality, when belief replaces evidence, and when entire communities are built on promises that cannot withstand scrutiny. The legacy of Rhyolite begins with speed. The town was born too fast, grew too fast, and demanded success faster than the ground beneath it could provide. There was no room for patience, no tolerance for uncertainty. Every decision assumed endless growth. Every structure assumed permanence. In that sense, Rhyolite was never designed to survive difficulty. It was designed only to succeed immediately. This is what makes its collapse so unsettling. The town did not fail because people were lazy or uninspired. It failed because too many people believed at once, and belief became a substitute for verification. Engineers were ignored. Warnings were silenced. Doubt was treated as betrayal. In Rhyolite, optimism was not just encouraged, it was enforced. The ruins expose how fragile confidence truly is. Banks that once symbolized stability now stand hollow. Homes built for families who expected generations of prosperity collapsed within years. Institutions meant to anchor the town vanished the moment money stopped flowing. Rhyolite reveals a harsh truth. Systems built on expectation rather than resilience do not decay slowly. They fall apart suddenly. There is also a deeper psychological lesson embedded in the desert. Rhyolite shows how difficult it is for people to walk away from collective illusions. Even when evidence mounted, many stayed. They stayed because leaving meant admitting error, losing identity, and facing uncertainty alone. The town collapsed not only because resources ran out, but because hope refused to adjust. This is why Rhyolite continues to fascinate long after its last resident left. It feels familiar. The patterns that destroyed it are not confined to the past. They repeat in financial bubbles, speculative booms, and modern cities built on trends rather than foundations. Rhyolite is a mirror, not a relic. The idea of a curse persists because it offers emotional closure. A supernatural explanation is easier than accepting that human behavior alone can create such devastation. But the true curse of Rhyolite was not the land. It was unchecked confidence combined with silence, greed, and denial. The desert simply enforced the outcome. Today, Rhyolite stands preserved not as a warning sign placed by nature, but as evidence left behind by people. Every broken wall marks a decision made too quickly. Every empty doorway represents a future imagined too confidently. The town endures because it tells a story without needing words. Rhyolite teaches that some places are not meant to be saved, not because they are cursed, but because saving them would require admitting uncomfortable truths about how they were created. Its silence is not empty. It is instructive. Before we end, ask yourself this. If you had stood in Rhyolite at its peak, surrounded by confidence, noise, and promises of fortune, would you have seen the collapse coming? Or would you have believed like everyone else? If you stayed until the end of this story, that means something about Rhyolite stayed with you. Cities like this do not disappear by accident. And the fact that you followed every step of its rise and collapse shows that you understand the deeper meaning behind these forgotten places. If this investigation made you think, take a moment to leave a comment below and write, "Rhyolite was never meant to last." Your comment helps keep these stories alive and lets me know you want more deep dives into abandoned cities and dark historical mysteries. Make sure to leave a like if this story held your attention and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next investigation. The next video appearing on your screen explores another place the world tried to forget, where ambition, disaster, and mystery collide once again.